What would you do if the person who hated you the most was the one who needed you the most? 10-year-old Malik was no stranger to struggle. Every night, he slept in a cardboard box behind an old diner, the only shelter he had. The box was small, but it was the best he could do. It shielded him from the cold wind that cut through the city streets, but it offered little protection from the harsh reality of his life. He didn't know what it felt like to have a warm bed or to sleep without fear. Every night, he curled up in that box, trying to stay warm, trying to shut out the hunger in his stomach, the aching loneliness in his heart. His clothes were torn, the fabric barely hanging together. They had once been hand-me-downs, but they had long since worn out, leaving him exposed to the elements. The patches on his shoes barely covered the holes, and he could feel every stone on the ground as he walked. His clothes didn't matter anymore. They were just another reminder of how little he had. But it was the hunger that gnawed at him the most. His stomach growled constantly, an ache that never seemed to go away. The only food he ever got was what he could scavenge from dumpsters behind fast food restaurants, or the scraps people left behind in parks. Sometimes, if he was lucky, someone might toss him a few coins. But that was rare. Most of the time he went without, trying to push the hunger down so he could focus on surviving. The world treated him like he didn't exist. He was just another face in the crowd, but one that no one ever saw. The city was filled with people going about their lives, too busy to care about someone like him. People crossed the road when they saw him coming, avoiding his eyes like they didn't want to acknowledge his existence. Store owners shooed him away before he could even ask for food. It didn't matter how polite or respectful he tried to be. They saw a dirty, hungry kid and wanted nothing to do with him. He had learned to keep his head down, to not ask for help, because no one ever offered it. He had learned that the hard way. The worst part? Nobody cared. Nobody ever asked him if he was okay, if he had eaten, if he had a place to stay. No one ever stopped to listen to his story or to look past the dirt on his face. They all assumed he was just another street kid, destined to be forgotten. He had come to believe that, too. But even in the midst of all this, Malik wasn't broken. He had learned how to survive. He had learned how to move through the streets unnoticed, how to avoid trouble and get by day after day. He had learned to trust only himself, because no one else had ever given him a reason to trust them. He had made it this far, and he was determined to keep going, to keep fighting for a life that seemed impossible. What he didn't know yet was that his life was about to change in a way he never expected. The streets had always been unkind, but they were about to lead him to something that would make him question everything he had believed about the world. He was about to meet someone who would change everything, someone who would see him for who he was, and not just as another invisible kid on the streets. Malik didn't know it, but he was about to find a chance at something more than survival, a chance at hope. What do you think Malik's future holds? Let us know in the comments. It was late at night, and Malik was searching for scraps behind a restaurant when he saw her. The chill in the air made the alley behind the restaurant feel colder than it should. But Malik was used to the cold by now. His stomach growled as he sifted through a garbage bin, looking for anything that could fill the emptiness inside. He wasn't picky. He had learned not to be. A half-eaten sandwich, a discarded piece of fruit, anything that would keep him going until the next day. Then, through the dim light of the street lamps, he saw her. A woman in her 30s, dressed to the nines, walking confidently down the sidewalk. Her expensive coat billowed around her as she moved, her heels clicking against the pavement with an air of authority. She looked every bit the part of someone who had everything: wealth, status, respect. Her expression was one of purpose as she walked, unaware of the world around her. But Malik noticed. He always did. He recognized her immediately, Mrs. Callahan. She was one of the worst, one of the people who never looked at him without disdain, who never gave him a second thought. Her eyes would slide past him as if he were invisible, just another fixture in the background of her life. He remembered the first time he'd tried to ask for help, a simple request for some food or change, and how she had looked at him like he was less than human. Keep the beggar out of sight. She had told a store owner once when she'd seen him sitting near the door, hoping for a little warmth. Malik didn't forget people like her. She had made sure he knew his place in the world, on the outskirts, unseen, unimportant. She had never acknowledged his existence, never once offered him the kindness he sometimes received from strangers who barely looked his way. To her, he was just another inconvenience, something to be avoided. But that night, she wasn't alone. As she walked, Malik noticed a man trailing behind her. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in dark clothes, his face hidden in the shadows. At first, Malik thought it was just a coincidence. Maybe the man was walking in the same direction. But then, he saw the way the man's pace quickened as he closed the distance between them. His hand, hidden at his side, seemed to grip something. Malik's heart skipped a beat. Something didn't feel right. Mrs. Callahan was too focused on her phone to notice the man approaching her. She kept walking, blissfully unaware of the danger that was getting closer with every step. The man was moving faster now, closing in on her. He wasn't just a passerby. This wasn't a coincidence. Malik's instincts kicked in. He didn't know what he could do, but he couldn't just stand there. Not after everything. Not when he could see what was happening. He had been invisible his whole life, treated like he didn't matter. But tonight, he had to act. He took a deep breath and moved quickly, stepping out from behind the restaurant, darting across the street in the shadows. He wasn't sure how to stop the man or what he could do, but he couldn't let Mrs. Callahan walk into that situation alone. He had learned how to survive, but this was different. "Hey!" Malik shouted, his voice rough from years of disuse. His words were aimed at the man, but they also reached Mrs. Callahan. She didn't notice at first, still absorbed in her phone, but the man froze. His head snapped toward Malik, eyes narrowing in an instant. For a moment it seemed like time stopped. The man's hand twitched toward his side, but then, without warning, he turned and walked briskly away from her, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as he had appeared. Malik's chest was tight, but he couldn't relax. He didn't know if the man was gone for good. The street was silent again, except for the distant sound of cars. Mrs. Callahan didn't even glance in his direction as she continued on, her phone still in her hand, her pace unchanged. She hadn't seen the danger. She hadn't seen the man or the threat he posed. But Malik had. What would you have done in Malik's position? Let us know in the comments. Would you save someone who wouldn't even look at you? Malik had seen it all. The streets had hardened him, made him numb to the chaos that unfolded every day. But as he watched from the shadows, something in his chest tightened when he saw the tall man in dark clothes step out from the alley. The man's face was covered with a mask, and his hands were clenched into fists, ready for whatever he intended to do next. Before Mrs. Callahan could even process the situation, the man lunged toward her. With one swift movement, he grabbed her purse, yanking it hard from her shoulder. Mrs. Callahan's scream pierced the silence of the street, but it was swallowed by the empty surroundings. No one was around to help. The city, which always bustled with activity, seemed eerily quiet in that moment. The street was deserted. Mrs. Callahan struggled, her voice desperate. "Let go of me," she shouted, clawing at the man's hands, trying to break free. She pulled at her purse, her feet scrambling on the pavement, but the man's grip was unyielding. The purse was heavy, her resistance useless against his strength. Malik stood still for a moment, frozen in disbelief. This was happening. He had seen thefts before, but this felt different. The man was ruthless, and Mrs. Callahan was alone, vulnerable. The urgency in her voice tugged at him, and he could hear her frantic breathing from where he stood. She had never treated him with kindness. She had dismissed him, made him feel invisible, even less than human. But that didn't matter now. He had two choices. He could walk away like he always had, like people always expected him to do. He could continue to be the invisible kid on the street. No one's problem, no one's responsibility. Or he could risk everything, his own safety, his own well-being, and step in to help her, to do the one thing that no one had ever done for him. To be seen. The man pulled harder on the purse, and Mrs. Callahan fell to the ground, her eyes wide with fear, as she tried to hold on to the strap. Malik's heart pounded, and without thinking, he moved. He sprinted toward them, his feet pounding against the pavement, adrenaline surging through his veins. He didn't know how he was going to stop the thief, or if he could do anything at all, but the thought of leaving her there, helpless, was too much. "Let go of her!" Malik shouted as he closed the distance between them. The man looked up in surprise, but there was no hesitation in Malik's voice, no fear in his actions. He wasn't thinking about the fact that the thief was bigger, that he was armed, or that Mrs. Callahan had treated him like dirt for years. He was thinking only of one thing. He had to act, and he had to act fast. "Get away from me," she screamed, backing away. A hungry, tired, homeless kid versus a grown man. What chance did he have? Malik didn't hesitate. He didn't even think. The robber was bigger, stronger, faster. But Malik had nothing to lose. He had spent his whole life fighting for survival, for scraps, for a place where he could simply exist without being pushed aside. This wasn't just about saving a woman who had treated him like dirt. It was about proving to himself that he could stand up, that he could make a difference, even if it was just for a moment. With all the force his small body could muster, Malik ran straight at the robber. The man was caught off guard for just a second, but his reflexes kicked in fast. He turned to face Malik, and the look on his face was filled with contempt, as if this homeless kid was nothing but a nuisance. Malik lunged for the man's arm, grabbing hold of it with everything he had, his fingers digging into the man's sleeve. But it wasn't enough. The robber swung his arm, throwing Malik back. But Malik wasn't done. He was determined. Malik got back on his feet, his heart pounding. He didn't care how big the man was, didn't care how strong he seemed. The only thing he cared about was stopping him. The robber's eyes narrowed, a sneer curling his lips. He was about to strike again, but Malik moved faster than the man expected. With no other option, Malik did the only thing he could think of. He bit down, hard. The man yelled in pain, a guttural sound of shock and anger as Malik's teeth sank into his arm. The sharp taste of blood filled Malik's mouth, but he didn't care. The man dropped the purse in surprise, staggering back from the sudden pain. The second of hesitation was all it took. Mrs. Callahan stumbled backward, gasping for air, her legs giving way as she tried to regain her balance. She fell, her breath ragged, her face pale. She wasn't used to this kind of danger, this kind of struggle. But Malik didn't look back. His focus was solely on the robber, the man who had nearly taken everything from her, and possibly from him as well. Malik stood between the man and Mrs. Callahan, his small body trembling but determined. He had no weapon, no training, no advantage, nothing but sheer will to protect her, to stop the man from hurting anyone else. The robber snarled, his eyes flashing with rage as he clenched his fist, preparing to strike. "Move, kid," he growled, his voice low and threatening. "You don't know who you're messing with." Malik's heart hammered in his chest as he braced for the blow. He knew he couldn't avoid it. His body was too small, too weak compared to the man. But he couldn't back down. This wasn't just about defending Mrs. Callahan. It was about proving to himself that he wasn't weak, that he wasn't nothing. The fist came, and Malik steeled himself for impact. What would you have done in Malik's shoes? Let us know in the comments. 1 second away from disaster, until fate stepped in. A siren blared in the distance, its wail growing louder by the second. The robber, realizing his escape was slipping away, cursed under his breath. He turned and bolted, running faster down the street, trying to get as far from the scene as possible. But it was too late. Flashing red and blue lights flooded the street, illuminating the scene in the sharp, staccato bursts. The police car screeched to a halt just a few feet from where Malik stood, still panting from the struggle. The doors flew open, and officers leapt out, immediately giving chase after the man. They were fast, and in moments, the thief was tackled to the ground, his attempts to escape thwarted by the swift action of the police. Malik stood there, watching as the scene unfolded, still trying to process what had just happened. Mrs. Callahan, still sitting on the ground, was shaking. Her hands clutched her purse, her eyes wide with shock. She hadn't moved, hadn't said a word since Malik had stepped in to stop the thief. She was still reeling from the danger, from the shock of the moment. Malik, still breathing heavily, turned to her, expecting her to yell at him, to push him away like she had done countless times before. He braced himself for her usual dismissive tone, for the insults and the words that would make him feel small. He had been treated like that his entire life. Like he didn't matter, like he was invisible. But when she looked up at him, there was something different in her eyes. She didn't look at him with contempt. She didn't sneer or turn away. No, she looked at him with wide, teary eyes, her expression filled with something Malik had never seen before, genuine gratitude. You saved me," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. The words hit Malik like a wave. He had never expected her to thank him, not after the way she had always treated him. He had never expected anyone to care. But there she was, looking at him with something more than indifference. She wasn't just seeing a homeless kid anymore. She wasn't just looking at the boy she had once dismissed. For the first time, she really saw him. Malik didn't know how to respond. His mind was racing. He had acted without thinking, without expecting anything in return, but here she was, acknowledging him in a way he never thought possible. Her eyes softened as she stared at him, and for the first time, Malik felt like he wasn't invisible. The officers had the robber in handcuffs now, leading him toward the police car. The immediate danger had passed, but the weight of the moment settled heavily between Malik and Mrs. Callahan. She was still on the ground, but now there was a shift. She wasn't scared of him. She wasn't angry. She was something else. I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice still shaky but full of something that felt like newfound respect. Malik shook his head, unsure of what to say either. The words were stuck in his throat. All he could do was stand there, breathing heavily, still processing what had just happened. For years, he had fought to be seen, to be heard, but he had never expected to find himself in this position. He had saved her life. He had stopped the thief. And now, for the first time, she was looking at him, really looking at him. He didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was certain: everything had changed. "What do you think will happen between Malik and Mrs. Callahan now? Let us know in the comments." She thought he was worthless, until he was the only one who cared. The police returned moments later, catching the thief just 2 blocks away, still struggling to break free. The officers quickly cuffed him and led him toward their car. The sounds of the street returned to normal, but the tension lingered in the air. Mrs. Callahan was still on the ground, shaken, clutching her purse like it was her lifeline. Her knuckles were white from holding on to it so tightly. She hadn't moved, still reeling from the chaos of the robbery, and perhaps from something deeper, the realization of how close she had come to losing everything, and how one person, a boy she had always ignored, had been the one to save her. She hadn't turned away from him, not like she usually would. She hadn't dismissed him, ignored him, or made him feel invisible. Instead, she stood there, her eyes not filled with judgment, but with something else, something she had never given him before. Recognition. She looked at Malik, really looked at him, for the first time in years. Why did you help me?" she asked, her voice trembling, still filled with disbelief. She didn't understand. She had treated him like dirt for so long, had looked through him as if he was nothing, and yet, when she needed help, he was the one who came through. Malik, still breathing heavily from the adrenaline, shrugged. His eyes met hers, and for once, he didn't look away. There was no shame in his gaze, no apology for the way he had acted, just raw honesty. "Because no one else would," he said simply. The words hit her harder than anything the robber had done. They were simple, but they cut deeper than she expected. She had spent years pretending Malik didn't exist, dismissing him, looking away when he needed help. She had ignored him like he was invisible, like his life didn't matter. But now, in the moment when it counted, when she was vulnerable and scared, it was Malik who had acted. It was Malik who had done what no one else could or would do. And for the first time, she saw him. She saw what she had overlooked all this time. The silence between them stretched for a moment as the weight of his words settled into her. She had always thought of herself as someone who helped others, someone who was good, someone who didn't need to rely on anyone else. But now she realized that it had been Malik who had been the true hero in this moment. He had been the one to step up, to save her, when no one else did. Mrs. Callahan reached into her purse, her hands shaking, still overwhelmed by everything that had happened. She pulled out a wad of bills and held it out to Malik. "Here. Take this," she said, her voice softer now, full of a new understanding. But Malik shook his head without hesitation. "I don't need your money," he said, his voice steady and clear. "I just want people like you to see me." For a moment, Mrs. Callahan didn't know what to say. She had been ready to offer him money, to give him something, anything, as if that could somehow make up for the way she had treated him. But it wasn't money that Malik wanted. It wasn't something she could give him with a simple transaction. What he wanted was something far more valuable: recognition, respect, acknowledgement. He wanted to be seen, not for his circumstances, not for the things people assumed about him, but for who he truly was, a person. With those words, Malik turned and began to walk away. No more words were spoken between them, but the air between them had changed. The distance that had always existed between them, the gap of indifference, of superiority, of neglect, was gone. As Malik disappeared into the night, Mrs. Callahan stood there, her hands still clutching her purse, her mind racing with thoughts she had never allowed herself to have before. She didn't know if she could change everything she had believed about Malik, but she knew one thing for certain: he had changed her, and that was something she would never forget. What do you think of Malik's choice? Let us know in the comments. Some people never change, but some do, if given the chance. Days later, a black car pulled up to the diner where Malik usually slept. The engine of the car hummed softly as it came to a stop. Malik, who had just finished rummaging through a trash bin behind the diner, paused. He looked up and saw Mrs. Callahan stepping out of the car. This was the last thing he expected. She wasn't carrying money, and she wasn't sneering at him like she had done before. She wasn't looking at him like he was beneath her, like he didn't matter. No, she was different. There was something in her eyes, something that Malik couldn't quite place. She looked at him as if she saw him for the first time, as if she had finally realized what was important. Malik stood still, uncertain of what to do as she walked toward him. The streetlights flickered above, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. Mrs. Callahan didn't hesitate. She walked up to him and, for the first time, didn't look away. She wasn't there to offer him pity or make him feel small. She was there to make things right. "Malik," she said, her voice steady but sincere, "I was wrong about you. And I was wrong about a lot of things." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment Malik didn't know how to respond. He had been treated like dirt by people his entire life, ignored, dismissed, and made to feel invisible. But now, in this moment, it felt like things were different. She wasn't just saying empty words. She wasn't apologizing for the sake of it. She was acknowledging something he had never expected from her. She held out an envelope. The way she handed it to him, the way she met his gaze, told him it wasn't just a gesture. It was something meaningful, something that came with intention. "This is for you," she said, her voice softer now, more genuine. Malik took the envelope hesitantly, his fingers brushing against the paper. It felt weighty in his hands, and as he opened it, he found something inside that took him by surprise. It wasn't money. It wasn't a handout. It was something far more valuable. A scholarship, a chance, a future. Malik's heart skipped a beat as he stared at the words printed on the paper. His eyes darted across the lines, reading and rereading, trying to comprehend what he was seeing. This wasn't just any scholarship. It was an opportunity for education, for a chance at something more than the life he had known, a chance at a life where he didn't have to survive on the streets, a chance at a future where he didn't have to fight for his place, where he could finally become something he had only dreamed of. The weight of it hit him all at once. This wasn't just an offer, it was a new beginning. He looked up at Mrs. Callahan, his voice thick with emotion. He didn't know what to say. Words felt inadequate for a moment like this. I don't know what to say," he whispered, still holding the envelope in his hands, unsure of what to do with it, unsure of what to do with himself. Mrs. Callahan smiled, but it wasn't the condescending smile he had come to expect from her. This smile was different. It was warm, full of something that had been missing before: genuine care, a recognition of his worth. "I know I can't undo what I've done," she said softly, "but I want to give you the future you deserve." Malik didn't have words to express what he was feeling. This moment, this change, was something he hadn't allowed himself to dream of. It was more than he could have imagined. A future, a real future. It felt like the impossible was finally within reach. Malik had saved a woman who had never cared about him. He had done it out of pure instinct, without expecting anything in return. But in the end, he had saved more than just her life. He had saved her humanity. She had seen him for who he was, and in doing so, had given him the most precious gift of all: hope. As Mrs. Callahan turned to leave, Malik stood there for a moment, watching her walk away, the envelope still in his hands. For the first time in his life, he realized that kindness had the power to change hearts, his own and others. Would you have done what Malik did? Comment below, like and share if you believe kindness can change hearts.